According to Robert Pinsky, the role of the nation's Poet Laureate is as undefined and open to interpretation as poetry itself. He has served in that role since being appointed last October and has just agreed to serve an additional year. He was a poet and literary critic long before his 1994 translation of the Inferno of Dante gained him a mass audience for the first time. His works of poetry include an explanation of America and the figured wheel, new and collected poems, which has recently been re-released. As part of his initiative as Poet Laureate, he's launched the Favorite Poem Project, a program that seeks to create an audio and visual archive of 1,000 Americans reading aloud their favorite poems. I am pleased to have Robert Pinsky join us now. How did it go, this collecting? I mean, you had invited me to participate, and I was looking forward to it, but I couldn't do it because I know Town Hall was hugely successful.
They're nice occasions. We've now had them at Town Hall, at the Library of Congress in D.C. We had one in L.A. and St. Louis. Both of those cities, the mayor of the city came out and read a poem. We've had school kids, preachers, well-known people, and they've been very moving occasions. One thing I hadn't anticipated is the way the people who read sort of root for one another. You can feel that, so that if it's a homeless person, as we had in Boston, reading an Emily Dickinson, and then the president of the Massachusetts Assembly, and the librarian of the Boston Public Library, and a school kid, they're listening to one another with that respect that people pay when someone is saying, not I'm a great performer, but these words mean a lot to me, I treasure them. And there's a kind of, it's interesting in, I guess you would call it an anthropological way, how the attention becomes very respectful and very intense when people do this. And that was a pleasant surprise to me. I hadn't thought about that aspect of it, the communal aspect of it.
Do you have one favorite?
Of course not.
You say of course not. So, but you mean if you have to read, you have to select something, don't you?
Sure. We ask people to read a favorite poem. I'm not eligible to read, by the way.
Because?
Very few
because
poets.
You're the Poet Laureate, or because you write poems?
Because I write poems. I mean, we may have, I thought it might be nice to ask perhaps some very senior poets or some very young ones. But for the most part, the project focuses on the vital life of poetry in the United States outside of the professional microcosm of poetry. So it's not mainly to do with poets or critics or actors. It's not experts. And this has to do with my notion of poetry, which is that its medium is the voice. It's a vocal medium, which is to say a bodily art, but not the body of the artist. In poetry, the audience's body, the audience's voice is the medium. So regardless of how you pronounce the word poem,
I'll get you too. Yeah.
The medium of the poet, the medium of Emily Dickinson, it's not Emily Dickinson's voice or a great actor's voice. It's whoever loves her poem and says it aloud. So if I say a Ben Jonson or a Yeats poem aloud to myself, my body, my voice, is the artist's medium. And that conviction is one thing underlying the project, is I think great poets write with the voice, and readers who love poems read them with their voice. And there's a special emotion one gets from hearing someone say aloud a poem the person loves. And it's not necessarily the emotion of watching a great performance.
Give me 5 you love, then.
Sailing to Byzantium by William Butler Yeats.
You must know it.
I think I know it by heart.
Just read to me. I mean, let me feel the experience.
The ending of that poem.
Yeah.
Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make, of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past and passing and to come. Probably made 9 mistakes, but that's pretty close.
It doesn't matter. You, at the conclusion of your term as Poet Laureate, what do you hope you will have accomplished?
It's an invitation to be grandiose, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But
I hope that
we celebrate culture here.
I hope that teaching of poetry in schools will focus a little bit more on the physical encounter with the poem. rather than imitating a literary critic. I think that the...
What does that mean, physical encounter?
Saying it aloud,
Okay.
typing it up or writing it into a personal anthology,
Yeah.
hearing somebody else say it aloud and say why they like it. I think that encounter should precede analysis or interpretation. And I suppose I would hope that to some little bit, perhaps the words poem or poetry would seem more a part of American life. I think poetry itself is part of the lives of Americans, but in public discourse, I think they're still slightly anomalous or embarrassing terms. I'm not a great expert on cultural history, but my impression is it's because we don't have two of the great sources of poetry in some cultures. We don't have a unifying folk culture. All the American grandpas and grandmas don't sing the same songs or say the same poems to the children.
As the Irish do? Or
the Irish or the Japanese or many groups. Probably even
poetry is a strong...
I'm not saying poetry's strong, I'm just saying they have a single folk culture. And we are many folk. We're a nation, I believe, but we're also, it's many folk. So that's from one direction. On the other hand, relative to many countries, we don't have the aristocratic idea. There's not an elite quite in this country that considers itself the traditional inheritor of art. To put it differently, we have no particular snob value to poetry in this country. And
so it needs, in fact, it needs two things. One, at least two, but one is accessibility. Two, it needs to be read, felt, physically touched in some way. And three, it needs a certain aristocracy to insist on its passing.
Well, I think that in America, a lot of things that other countries do through social class, in a word, we do through school. And through this project, I get thousands of letters from people who had to memorize something in school, or they had a wonderful teacher who made them like something in school. And it makes me have a renewed respect for the people who work hard in the American public school system. Some of them do things that are good.
We've had a lot of people talk about poetry on this program, as you may or may not know. Here is just one, Maya Angelou describing poetry. Here it is. You think that poetry is music for the voice.
That's right, written for the human voice. That's right. It is all music. Whether, I mean, I go back to Paul Laurence Dunbar, to Edgar Allan Poe, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Nikki Giovanni. All poetry is music written for the human voice, and it only comes into its own when it is spoken. It's fine, it's wonderful to see professors of literature in the Ivy League universities and colleges looking at what is called concrete poetry. That is poetry which is to be seen, and so how it is shaped is so important to the poetry. That's fine. That may be true. But for me, until the human voice gives it elevation, it doesn't really sing. It doesn't come into its own. It doesn't lift the heart and make the blood race and, you know, help the circulation.
Similar views.
Yes.
You once said that prose is like wading in water. Poetry is like skating on ice.
Yes, well, you do change direction very quickly in a poem, and I think it's the swiftness of poetry is one of the things that does excite me. But you know, waiting is nice. You can really notice things. You can see the anemone. I'd say reading a 19th century novel, reading a Dickens novel. Waiting is not bad, but there is a speed to poetry that's, I think, related to the physicality. When you're enjoying the ride so intensely of the voice, I think then you're happy to put up with very rapid cuts. That poetry in some ways anticipates the rhythms of music videos.
Well, I was coming to that. Are people who create music and write their own music? I mean, or in a sense, they are poets today, without disparaging people who are poets in the traditional way, like you.
There's something about the fundamental technology of the human body alone that goes very deep in us. The only equipment you need to experience a poem is your own body and your mind. And I play music, I love music, I like my computer, I like my CD player, I like TV. But there's a part of my imagination that goes very deep. I think it's one of the first things the animal did is develop means of memory and communication. What we now divide into poetry and song and dance, indubitably were sort of joined as a way of getting information, not only between us contemporaries, but between us and our ancestors and our descendants. If you have it with a rhyme or a tune or a set of gestures, you can remember it, you can transmit it better. Well, that to me is almost a genetic, it's almost in us biologically. And I feel that intensely when not only when I say a poem to myself, but when I watch someone do it. So this is not to reject the idea that there are great lyricists, or that, you know, people like Ben Jonson, certainly, in that period, people wrote many great poems that were great songs. It can be done.
Take a look at this also. This is another poet, Allen Ginsberg. What do you think of the 90s? Does the 90s have any stirrings of a previous decade in the same way that, you know, David Halberstam in his book about the 50s pretty much says that the 60s came about because of forces that were at work in the late 50s?
Well, poetry in 60s, 50s, and 90s is a unique...
50s, 60s, and 90s. Forget 70s and 80s.
Well, yeah, 70s and 80s were dominated by homogenized mechanical lying all over, well, both in media and in the government.
Homogenized lying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about the poetry of the 90s?
I think what's happened is that in the 90s there's a huge resurgence of poetry readings and a revival of Beat Generation literature.
Yeah.
And I think that's because there's the unique individual voice, authentic, as distinct from the canned voice of media and the lying voice of government.
What's the state of poetry today?
I wouldn't pretend to moralize as Allen Ginsberg does. State of poetry today, in my opinion, is there seems to be an intense upsurge of interest in poetry. Without going as far as Allen just did, I'd say that this is, in my view, partly in reaction to something I actually welcome. As I say, I love technology. I like a lot of these things, but they're mass media. The CD, the music CD with a moving image on it and music can be reproduced literally millions of times, very rapidly, and sent to New Zealand and Pakistan and Bolivia in a matter of minutes. The medium of poetry is one person. And I think even though one part of my imagination loves the mass media, another part of my imagination deeply craves something that's inherently, through its medium, on a human scale. And I think perhaps that's why there are so many poetry readings.
And so therefore technology enhances an appreciation of the modern world, enhances appreciation of poetry because it is quieter and...
Maybe sometimes it's noisy too,
noisy
poetry,
too,
but whatever it is, it's on a human scale.
Right.
It's on a scale that predates digital technology. And I think we have a craving for that.
And does that mean that there's a kind of resurgence because of that condition?
No question.
You could document there's a resurgence in poetry.
You can do it by looking at sales of books. It's not an opinion. More people buy more books of poems than formerly.
When would you become a poet?
Somebody told me that one answer to that is to say, when did you stop being a poet? Implying that everyone is up to a certain age. Everyone is constantly making little rhymes up and bopping along in language. And then by 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, most people quit. And maybe I just never got good enough at anything else to stop.
But there was a sense that my commitment is to forge a life in poetry.
Me personally, I grew up in a kind of a lower middle class social ambience. The idea of being a poet was not available. My daydreams tended to be of being an artist of some kind. Dancer, an actor, painter, make buildings.
Then why a poet?
All along, I was thinking about the sounds of words. That the S at the beginning of sounds goes S, and the one at the end of sounds goes Z, and uses this organ down here. I didn't know there were names for that. And it's a voiced and an unvoiced consonant. The voiced one at the end of sounds. And I would think about rhythms. Charlie Rowe show. Oh, at the end, Charlie Rowe show. And I didn't know there was any art that could be made out of that. It was a habit, like biting your nails. I think it was a habit, biting your nails. Bite. Habit, like biting your nails. I do that. I think I've been doing it since I learned to talk. When I went away to college, I read Ginsberg, Donne, Yeats in particular, William Carlos Williams, Frost, and I had great teachers who showed me there was an art based on and at the time I was ambitious to be a musician. And I can't even remember the transition between daydreams of being a great jazz player to daydreams of being a great poet. I found out there was an art suited to would have been a habit.
Robert Pinsky, Poet Laureate of the United States of America. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.